Evelyn Harper had always believed that the worst kind of heartbreak wasn't losing someone, it was realizing they had stopped seeing you long before you were gone. At 78 years old, Evelyn lived alone in a beautiful white colonial house outside Portland, Oregon. The home sat on nearly 5 acres of land, tall oak trees surrounded the property, a winding driveway curved toward the front porch. It was the kind of place people admired when they drove past, but to Evelyn it wasn't valuable because of the land, it was valuable because of the memories. 46 years earlier, she and her husband, Richard, had bought the property when they were newly married. Together they planted every tree, built every garden, painted every room, raised 3 children. Countless birthdays had been celebrated there. Countless Christmas mornings had filled the house with laughter. After Richard passed away 12 years earlier, the house became her connection to him. Every corner carried a memory, every room carried a piece of their life together. Unfortunately, her children saw something different. Her oldest son, Nathan, was 54, a successful businessman on the surface. Behind the scenes, however, his company was struggling badly, his debts were growing. His investors were leaving, and he desperately needed money. Her daughter, Victoria, was 51. She loved luxury, expensive vacations, Diffanaza clothing, upscale restaurants. Her social media life looked perfect. Her financial life was a disaster. Then there was Ethan, the youngest, 47 years old, charming, funny, and perpetually chasing shortcuts to success. Every year brought a new business idea, every year ended the same way. Failure. Evelyn loved all 3 of them equally, she always would. But lately something felt different. Phone calls had become rare, visits had become shorter, conversations felt rushed. Yet whenever finances entered the discussion, their attention suddenly sharpened. At first she ignored it, then she noticed it, eventually she couldn't stop noticing it. One Monday morning, Evelyn visited her doctor for routine testing, nothing serious, just annual examinations, blood work, heart monitoring, the normal realities of aging. The appointment ended peacefully. The doctor wasn't concerned. Unfortunately, a misunderstanding changed everything. A nurse accidentally contacted Nathan regarding additional test scheduling. The message was harmless, further evaluation, nothing urgent. Nothing dangerous, yet by the time the information reached the rest of the family, the story had transformed completely. By evening, Victoria was crying on the phone. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" Evelyn frowned. "Tell you what?" "That you're seriously ill." Evelyn nearly laughed. "What are you talking about?" But the rumor had already spread. By the next day, Ethan called twice. Nathan appeared at her house unexpectedly. Relatives she hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reached out. Everyone seemed convinced that Evelyn was dying. No matter how many times she corrected them, nobody seemed interested in listening. The possibility of bad news had already captured their imagination. At first, the attention felt comforting. Nathan visited 3 times that week. Victoria brought homemade meals. Ethan called every evening. For a brief moment, Evelyn believed the misunderstanding might actually strengthen the family. Then she overheard a conversation, and everything changed. One afternoon, Nathan and Victoria were sitting on the back patio. Evelyn was inside preparing tea. The kitchen window happened to be open. She wasn't trying to listen, the words simply drifted toward her. "Have you seen the property values lately?" Nathan asked. Victoria sighed. "I know." Evelyn froze. Nathan continued. "The house alone is probably worth over 3 million. Silence followed, then Victoria spoke. "What do you think Mom's will says?" The teacup nearly slipped from Evelyn's hand. She stood completely still, listening, heart pounding. Nathan lowered his voice. "I have no idea." Victoria sighed. "We should probably find out." Evelyn slowly stepped away from the window. The excitement she had felt earlier vanished immediately, replaced by something far heavier, disappointment, not because they mentioned inheritance. People think about inheritance. That was normal. What hurt was how quickly the conversation had appeared. 1 week earlier, they barely had time for her. Now they had time to discuss her estate. That realization stayed with her. Days later, the family gathered for Sunday dinner. Evelyn hoped the atmosphere would feel different. Perhaps she was overthinking. Perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps the evening began pleasantly, the grandchildren played outside, stories were shared, people laughed then. After dessert, Ethan made a mistake, a very revealing mistake. "Mom," he said casually, "have you updated your will recently?" The room became silent. Immediately, Victoria looked down. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn stared at her son. "Why do you ask?" Ethan forced a smile. "Just curious." Curious, such an innocent word, yet somehow it always appeared before questions about money. The rest of dinner felt uncomfortable. Everyone sensed the tension. Nobody addressed it. That night Evelyn sat alone in her living room. Rain tapped gently against the windows. A framed photograph rested beside her chair. It showed Richard holding Nathan as a toddler. Victoria sat on his shoulders. Ethan laughed beside them. The picture captured a perfect day, a perfect family. Looking at it made her emotional, because somewhere along the way things had changed. The next month brought additional medical appointments. Nothing alarming appeared. Her doctors remained optimistic, yet every test seemed to convince her children that death was approaching. Soon they began discussing practical matters more openly. Too openly. One afternoon, Evelyn returned home unexpectedly after a cancelled appointment. As she entered the house, voices drifted from the dining room. Nathan, Victoria, Ethan, all three sat around the table. Documents covered every surface. Property estimates, tax reports, real estate evaluations. Evelyn stopped in the doorway. Nobody noticed her. Once the property sells, everything becomes easier, Nathan said. Victoria nodded. "We just need to know what we're working with." Ethan laughed softly. "The house alone changes everything." For several moments Evelyn simply stared, then she spoke. "What exactly changes?" The room exploded into silence. Three startled faces turned toward her. Nobody answered because there was no good answer. Only truth, and the truth wasn't flattering. Evelyn slowly looked at the documents. Then back at her children. A painful smile crossed her face. "Am I already gone?" Nobody spoke. Victoria's eyes filled with embarrassment. Nathan looked away. Ethan suddenly became fascinated by the floor. That evening Evelyn cried, not because of money, because of sadness, because her children seemed more interested in preparing for her death than appreciating her life, and deep down she feared the situation was only beginning. What she didn't know was that within weeks she would hear something far worse, something that would force her to make a decision capable of changing her family forever. The weeks that followed felt different, not because Evelyn's health changed, because her perspective changed. Once someone notices a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. Every phone call, every visit, every question. Everything suddenly carried a different meaning. Nathan called more often than he had in years. Victoria began stopping by twice a week. Ethan appeared whenever he heard about a doctor's appointment, to anyone outside the family. It would have looked wonderful, 3 devoted children rallying around their aging mother. Evelyn knew better. The timing was simply too perfect. One afternoon Victoria arrived carrying flowers and a basket of pastries. Evelyn welcomed her inside. For nearly half an hour they talked about ordinary things, weather, family, the grandchildren. Then the conversation slowly drifted toward familiar territory. "Mom, have you ever thought about downsizing?" Evelyn looked up from her coffee. "Downsizing?" Victoria nodded. "The house is so big. I like my house, I know." Victoria smiled. "But eventually it might be easier to move somewhere smaller." Evelyn studied her daughter's face carefully. "What makes you think I'm leaving?" Victoria immediately looked uncomfortable. "That's not what I meant." Of course it wasn't, at least not officially. The conversation ended shortly afterward, but the feeling remained, the same feeling Evelyn had been carrying for months. People weren't discussing her future. They were discussing her absence. A few days later, Nathan invited her to lunch. For a moment she felt hopeful. Maybe her son simply wanted to spend time together. Maybe she was wrong. The restaurant overlooked the Columbia River. The view was beautiful. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt normal. They laughed at memories, talked about Richard, then Nathan leaned forward. "I've been thinking." Evelyn already knew she wasn't going to like the next sentence. About what? The property. There it was, Agon, Always the property, always the money, Nathan continued. If something happens unexpectedly. If everyone knew your plans. Evelyn set down her fork. My plans? He nodded. For the estate. The word estate hung between them, cold, heavy, unwelcome. Evelyn smiled politely, then changed the subject. But inside, another piece of her heart broke. That evening she visited Richard's grave. The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the valley. She often went there when life became complicated. The grass moved gently in the wind. Birds sang somewhere nearby. For a long time she sat quietly beside the headstone. Finally she spoke. I miss you. Tears filled her eyes, because if Richard were alive, none of this would be happening, or maybe it would. Maybe they would simply face it together. She laughed softly through her tears. You always knew how to handle difficult conversations. The silence that followed felt strangely comforting. Then she said something she had been afraid to admit. I think they're waiting for me to die. The words hurt, even speaking them aloud felt wrong, yet deep down she feared they were true. The next month brought another surprise. One afternoon Evelyn met her closest friend, Gloria, for lunch. The two women had known each other for over 30 years. Nothing escaped Gloria's attention. After listening carefully, Gloria shook her head. They've already spent the money. Evelyn frowned. What do you mean? In their minds, Gloria leaned forward. They don't see it as your money anymore. The statement landed hard because it explained everything. The conversations, the assumptions, the entitlement. Somewhere along the way, her children had begun viewing her assets as future possessions, not gifts, not blessings, expectations. A week later, something happened that shattered any remaining doubt. Evelyn had an appointment with a cardiologist. The doctor wanted additional testing, nothing serious, just precautionary. Afterward, she decided to stop by a nearby restaurant for lunch. As she entered the building, familiar voices caught her attention. Nathan, Victoria, Ethan. All three sat in a private corner booth. Curious, she paused. Then she heard enough to stop breathing. What happens if Mom changes the will? Ethan asked. Nathan sighed heavily. She won't. How can you be sure? Because she's always taken care of us. Victoria nodded. Exactly. She wouldn't leave us with nothing. Evelyn stood frozen, completely frozen. The conversation continued. I just hope everything is divided equally, Victoria said. Nathan laughed. The house alone solves most of our problems. The house, Agan, always the house, always the money. Not one person asked how she was feeling. Not one person discussed spending more time with her. Not one person talked about making memories. Only inheritance, only assets. Only future wealth, quickly. Evelyn turned around and left. They never knew she had been there. That evening she sat alone in her living room, staring at the family photographs covering the walls. Each picture represented a chapter of her life: birthday parties, school graduations, and Christmas mornings, family vacations, moments she treasured. Looking at them now felt different, painful. Because she realized something heartbreaking. She remembered memories. Her children remembered value. The following morning, Evelyn called her attorney, Daniel Mercer, a man she trusted completely, when she arrived at his office. He immediately sensed something serious. What happened? For nearly an hour she told him everything. The conversations, the property discussions, the restaurant incident, the growing obsession with inheritance. Daniel listened carefully, never interrupting. When she finally finished, he folded his hands. What are you thinking? Evelyn stared out the window. The answer had been growing inside her for weeks, maybe months. I'm thinking my children need a lesson. Daniel raised an eyebrow. A lesson? She nodded slowly. One they'll never forget. The attorney remained silent, waiting. Then Evelyn said something that would change everything. Something capable of shocking her entire family. I want to change my will. Daniel studied her carefully. Are you certain? Evelyn thought about Nathan, Victoria, Ethan, the people she loved more than anyone in the world. Then she remembered the restaurant conversation, the property evaluations, the inheritance planning, the funeral rumors, and finally she nodded. Yes. For the first time in her life, she was completely certain. Because her children believed they were preparing for her death, what they didn't realize was that Evelyn Harper was preparing for their future. And when the truth eventually came out,
Nothing in the family would ever be the same again.
When Evelyn left Daniel Mercer's office, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: clarity. The sadness was still there, the disappointment remained. But the uncertainty was gone. For nearly a year she had questioned herself. Wondered if she was being unfair. Wondered if she was imagining things. Now she knew she wasn't. The evidence had become impossible to ignore, the conversations, the assumptions, the entitlement. Most painful of all, the way her children spoke about her future as if she were no longer part of it. The following weeks passed quietly. Evelyn never mentioned the meeting with her attorney. She never hinted that anything had changed. Instead, she watched, listened, observed. And the more she observed, the more convinced she became she had made the right decision. Nathan's financial situation continued worsening. His company lost another major contract. Investors began pulling out. Every conversation seemed to include subtle references to money. One afternoon, he stopped by unexpectedly. They sat together in the sunroom overlooking the garden. For a while they talked about ordinary things, then Nathan sighed heavily. The economy is brutal right now. Evelyn nodded. I've heard. He stared out the window. Sometimes I wonder how different life would be if I had a little financial breathing room. Evelyn said nothing. She knew exactly where the conversation was heading. Nathan continued. Dad always wanted the family taken care of. There it was, not a direct request, not yet. But close enough. Evelyn smiled politely and changed the subject. Nathan looked disappointed, very disappointed. A few days later, Victoria visited. She brought expensive pastries from a bakery downtown. Evelyn appreciated the gesture. Unfortunately, the visit followed a familiar pattern. Within 30 minutes, Victoria was discussing rising costs, credit card debt, mortgage payments, luxury expenses she could no longer comfortably afford. Then came the comment that stayed with Evelyn for days afterward. At least one day, all of this stress will be behind us. Evelyn looked confused. What do you mean? Victoria immediately realized she had said too much. Nothing. But both women knew exactly what she meant. One day. When the inheritance arrived, when financial problems magically disappeared, when someone else's lifetime of work became available, that night, Evelyn couldn't sleep, not because she was angry, because she was heartbroken. Parents spend decades sacrificing for their children, working, saving, providing, protecting, never expecting repayment, but they do expect something: love, respect, appreciation. And lately those things seemed harder to find than discussions about money. A month later, another family gathering took place. This time it was Ethan's birthday. The entire family attended. Children ran through the backyard. Music played softly. The atmosphere seemed warm and relaxed. For several hours Evelyn actually enjoyed herself. Then she went inside to use the restroom. As she walked down the hallway, voices drifted from the study. Nathan. Victoria. Ethan. Agan. Evelyn stopped. Not intentionally, instinctively. Then she heard the words that changed everything. We should probably start planning the funeral. The air left her lungs. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood. Then Nathan spoke again. If something happens soon, we'll need arrangements ready. Victoria nodded. I've already looked at a few funeral homes. Evelyn stood frozen. Completely frozen. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled, and then Ethan laughed softly. I just hope she doesn't make any last-minute changes. Nathan smiled. Why would she? The three siblings laughed, not cruelly. Not maliciously. Casually, as though discussing weather, as though discussing groceries, as though their mother wasn't still alive, as though she wasn't standing just outside the room listening. Tears immediately filled Evelyn's eyes. She quietly turned around and walked away. No confrontation, no argument, no scene. Just silence, the kind of silence heartbreak creates. That night she sat alone on her porch for hours. Watching the stars, thinking about Richard, thinking about her children, thinking about life. Eventually she came to a painful conclusion. Her children loved her. She truly believed that. But somewhere along the way, they had become distracted by money, distracted by expectations, distracted by what they believed would eventually belong to them. The next morning, she called Daniel Mercer. I need to make one final adjustment. The attorney didn't sound surprised. All right. Can you meet today? Of course. 2 hours later, they sat together inside his office. Daniel reviewed several documents, then looked up. Once this is signed, there will be no confusion. Evelyn nodded. That's exactly what I want. The paperwork took less than 30 minutes, yet those signatures would completely alter the future, not just financially, emotionally. Morally, for generations, when everything was finished, Daniel carefully placed the documents inside a secure file, then he looked at Evelyn. Do you think they'll understand? Evelyn stared quietly at the window. The answer came slowly. Not immediately, Daniel nodded. Eventually, a sad smile crossed her face. I hope so. Months passed. Winter arrived, then spring. Life seemed to settle into a routine. Until one cold February morning, Evelyn collapsed. It happened without warning. She was watering plants in her kitchen when a sharp pain struck her chest. The watering can slipped from her hand. Water spilled across the floor. Then darkness. The next thing she remembered was the sound of sirens, bright lights, voices, hospital walls. Doctors moved quickly, tests were performed, specialists were called. The situation was serious. Far more serious than anyone expected. Nathan received the first phone call. Within an hour, all 3 children were racing toward the hospital. Fear consumed them, real fear, the kind no amount of money can solve. When they arrived, a doctor met them in the waiting room. His expression immediately told them something was wrong, very wrong. Evelyn's condition is critical. The words hit like a hammer. Victoria started crying instantly. Nathan sat down heavily. Ethan simply stared, unable to speak. For the first time in months, nobody mentioned houses, nobody mentioned inheritance, nobody mentioned wills. None of it mattered anymore. Because suddenly there was a possibility far more terrifying than financial uncertainty. Losing their mother. Days passed, then weeks. Evelyn fought hard. Some days she improved, other days she didn't. Doctors remained cautious. No promises, no guarantees. The uncertainty changed everyone. Nathan stopped talking about money. Victoria stopped talking about debt. Ethan stopped chasing shortcuts. Every day they sat beside Evelyn's hospital bed talking. Remembering, apologizing. For the first time in years, they acted like family again. But what none of them knew was that Daniel Mercer held a sealed envelope waiting inside his office, an envelope containing Evelyn's final message. A message capable of shocking the entire family, and if Evelyn didn't survive, that message would soon reveal a truth none of them were prepared to hear.
The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines. Sunlight filtered through the curtains as Evelyn slowly opened her eyes. Everything felt distant, heavy, yet peaceful. For a moment she simply stared at the ceiling. Then she noticed familiar faces sitting nearby. Nathan, Victoria. All 3 looked exhausted. Their eyes were red. Their clothes were wrinkled. Fear had aged them. The moment they saw her awake, relief flooded their faces. Victoria immediately grabbed her hand. Tears filled her eyes. Mom. Evelyn smiled weakly. Hello, sweetheart. Victoria started crying, not politely, not quietly. The kind of crying that comes from guilt, from regret. From realizing time is running out. I'm sorry. Evelyn looked at her gently. For what? Victoria couldn't stop the tears. For everything. The room became silent. Nathan lowered his head. Ethan stared at the floor. Because all 3 knew exactly what she meant. The missed visits, the selfish conversations, the inheritance discussions, the assumptions, the years spent treating tomorrow like a guarantee. Nathan finally stood, his voice shook. I should have spent more time with you. Evelyn looked at him. The little boy she once taught to ride a bicycle seemed visible again beneath the aging face. I thought there would always be more time. A tear rolled down his cheek. Then another. Ethan stepped closer. For several moments he couldn't speak. Finally he whispered, I've been chasing money my whole life. His voice cracked, and I almost forgot what mattered. Evelyn felt her own eyes filling with tears, not because she was sad, because this was all she ever wanted. Honesty, love, presence, the things money could never buy. Over the following week her condition improved slightly. Doctors became cautiously hopeful, then unexpectedly, everything changed. An infection developed, complications followed. Her body grew weaker. The doctors did everything possible. But Evelyn understood something before anyone else. Her journey was nearing its end. One evening she asked for a private family meeting. Only Nathan, Victoria, Ethan, no doctors, no nurses, no interruptions. The room became quiet. Evelyn looked at each of them carefully, memorizing faces, memorizing smiles, memorizing the people she loved most. Then she spoke. "If I leave before you," immediately Victoria began crying again. Evelyn smiled softly. "Listen." The room fell silent. "I don't want you fighting." Nobody interrupted. "I don't want money destroying this family." Nathan wiped tears from his eyes. Ethan nodded silently. Victoria squeezed her mother's hand. Evelyn continued. "I spent my entire life building something." The children listened carefully. "But the most important thing I built wasn't this house." She paused. "It wasn't my savings." Another pause. "It was all of you." Nobody could hold back their tears now. Years of misunderstandings seemed to collapse in that moment. For the first time in a very long time, everyone understood what mattered. 3 days later, Evelyn Harper passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news devastated the family. The funeral was held the following week. Hundreds attended, former co-workers, neighbors, friends, church members. People Evelyn had quietly helped throughout her life. Story after story emerged. A scholarship she secretly funded, a struggling family she supported, a widow she visited every week. Acts of kindness her own children never knew about. Nathan sat silently through most of the service, listening, thinking, regretting. Victoria cried nearly the entire day. Ethan barely spoke for the first time. Inheritance wasn't on anyone's mind. Only loss, only love, only grief. A week later, the family gathered inside Daniel Mercer's office. The official reading of Evelyn's will had arrived. The atmosphere felt heavy. Nobody knew what to expect. Daniel entered carrying a large folder. After offering condolences, he sat down, then opened the file. The room became completely silent. Evelyn's final wishes were about to be revealed. The attorney began reading. Personal belongings came first: photographs, jewelry, family keepsakes, letters, and rich in memories rather than money. Then came charitable donations, huge charitable donations. Millions of dollars directed toward children's hospitals, education programs, veteran support organizations, senior care services. The room looked stunned. Even Nathan hadn't realized how much wealth his mother possessed. Then Daniel removed a sealed envelope. Across the front were written 4 simple words: "To my children." The attorney carefully opened it, then began reading. "My dear children, if you are hearing this letter, then my time on earth has ended. Before anything else, I need you to know one thing. I love you. Nothing that follows comes from anger. Nothing comes from revenge. Everything comes from love." The room became perfectly still. Daniel continued. "For a long time, I watched something happen to our family slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Money became louder than love." Nathan lowered his eyes. Victoria began crying. Ethan stared at the floor. The attorney continued. "When people believed I was dying, I heard conversations I was never supposed to hear." The room froze. Nathan looked up. Victoria covered her mouth. Ethan's face turned pale. "I heard discussions about property, about inheritance, about funeral plans, while I was still alive." Silence, painful silence. Nobody could look at each other, because they knew it was true. Every word, every sentence. Every disappointment. Then the letter changed. Its tone softened. "I was hurt, very hurt, but I also saw something important." The attorney continued reading. "When my condition became truly serious, everything changed. You stopped discussing money, you stopped discussing assets, you remembered how to be my children again." Tears filled the room. Daniel paused briefly before continuing. "I saw fear, I saw regret, I saw love, real love. And that gave me hope." The attorney unfolded the final page. Then came the revelation, the surprise nobody expected. "The majority of my estate will not be inherited directly." Nathan frowned. Victoria blinked. Ethan looked confused. Daniel continued. "Instead, everything has been placed into the Harper Legacy Trust." The room became silent. The attorney explained. The trust contained nearly all of Evelyn's remaining wealth. Several $1 million, the house, the land, investments, everything. But there were conditions, stern conditions. The money could not be used for luxury purchases. It could not be used for expensive vacations. It could not be used to fund reckless spending. Instead, it could only be used for education, healthcare, family emergencies, approved business ventures, scholarships, community projects, future generations of the Harper family. The room sat frozen. Then Daniel read Evelyn's final paragraph. My greatest fear was never that you would lose my money. My greatest fear was that you would lose yourselves chasing it. Money should create opportunities. Not entitlement, purpose, not greed. If this trust helps you remember that lesson, then every dollar I earned was worth earning. Tears streamed down Nathan's face. Victoria openly sobbed. Ethan covered his eyes. But Evelyn wasn't finished. One final page remained. Daniel unfolded it slowly, then smiled, a surprised smile. The house will not be sold. Everyone looked up. Confused, Daniel continued. The house will remain a permanent family home. Any descendant of the Harper family may stay there. Any family gathering may be held there. Any family member facing such hardship may find shelter there. Because some things are worth more than money. The room became completely silent. Then Daniel read the final sentence. When you miss me, don't visit my grave, go home, sit on the porch, watch the sunset, law together. And remember that family was always the real inheritance. Nobody spoke, nobody could, because in that moment they finally understood. The house had never been the treasure, the money had never been the treasure. The trust had never been the treasure was the woman who built it all. And by the time they realized that, she was gone. In the years that followed, the Harper family changed. Nathan rebuilt his business honestly. Victoria became involved in the charitable foundation funded by the trust. Ethan finally stopped chasing shortcuts and started helping manage community projects. Every summer the family gathered at Evelyn's house. Children played beneath the oak trees. Grandchildren ran across the fields. Stories were shared, memories were kept alive. And every evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, someone inevitably pointed toward Evelyn's favorite rocking chair on the porch. The chair remained empty, but somehow it never felt that way, because the greatest inheritance Evelyn Harper left behind wasn't wealth. It wasn't property, it wasn't investments, it was a lesson, a reminder that love is the only thing we take with us, and the only thing worth leaving behind.